How about now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. All right. So that one's up. The roughest start to any presentation I've given. Here, share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Finally. Okay. Let's here present. So yes, officially the roughest intro to any talk that I've given. So what we're going to talk about today is using Ansible with Azure. And to dovetail off of what was said previously about experience in Azure, this presentation actually started way back when I didn't have any experience in Azure, and that was only probably about a year ago. And what I did was I knew Ansible, but I didn't know Azure. And so really what this talk is about is how I transitioned my knowledge of Ansible and use that against Azure to scale up in Azure. And the basic outcome that you'll get from this talk is, in the end, it will be setting up an Ansible development environment, which will consist of a local container, Docker container running CentOS, that you'll use as your operations box to run automation against Azure in the cloud. And then you will also have a Linux VM and a Windows VM, so that way you can write Ansible code locally and then run it through the container, but then target the cloud-hosted systems. Now, this talk's going to be a little bit different than a traditional one. There's really just a few slides here. Right after this, we're going to go into a demo, and I'm going to essentially walk through a book that I'm writing, and then walk through all the exercises in there. And then the end artifact will be a local, well, I guess a cloud and container development with Ansible that you can use to get started. And so if you are coming from a background where you know Azure more, this could be a good opportunity to learn Ansible or vice versa. The technologies complement each other really well. And then for the people that are huge Terraform fans in the audience, I'm not advocating that Ansible is better than Terraform in any ways. I think that Terraform definitely has a stronger case when it's provisioning infrastructure. But I think, as what you'll come to know, is there is a fit for Ansible in the equation too, as far as a configuration management tool and orchestration engine for your infrastructure. So that is that slide. We'll go ahead and get started with the demo. So if we get started, the very first thing that we'll do is we're going to set up the Ansible environment. And those that aren't familiar with Ansible, it essentially is a program that needs to run. It only runs on Linux. So you have a few options. One is if you're on a Mac, you can install it locally on your operating system. Two, if you're running a Windows laptop or desktop, you can use WSL and emulate Linux environment in there and install it that way. Or another option is you can use a container running on either operating system. There's some benefits to a container later down the road. A container is more disposable. So if you want to manipulate your environment, or if you want to just completely start it from scratch, you don't have to uninstall a bunch of stuff or restart. It also makes collaboration across your team a lot easier, where you can all work off of a base image, and then you can modify that image at runtime as you see fit, to maybe troubleshoot or to upgrade the version and test out some playbooks. But it also becomes very useful when you start to use infrastructure as code, as far as building a release pipeline around that and automating your deployments of infrastructure code. You can use that Ansible container inside your build process to run linting or to run integration tests. And then you can also use that same container when you go and deploy to production systems. And what the container allows you to do is to have a consistent experience from your development on your local laptop all the way through your build pipeline to deploying to production. And that's why I often, 90% of the time, I'm developing Ansible from within inside a container. So to get started, we'll walk through kind of a crash course in Docker and walk through the steps that you need to do to get started with setting up an Ansible environment in Docker. I already have Docker installed, and hopefully I won't have to restart my computer again. But you'll need that to get started. There's other ways to use Docker. Docker Desktop is a really easy, lightweight tool that you can use. You can use it on Mac or Windows. Again, Windows supports Linux containers, so you should be able to use the containers that I'm using here on a Windows machine as well as a Mac. So very first step is you want to have Docker Desktop installed. I already have that installed up here. And I guess before I continue, is the screen resolution okay? Is it too small or need to be any bigger?
Looks good to me.
Okay, awesome. So the very first step when you want to build, when you want to use a container is you need to create a Docker file. So if you're familiar with building any kind of infrastructure with code, you need some way of codifying that. And a lot of times it's a bootstrap script with PowerShell, or maybe you've moved into using desired state configuration with PowerShell for Windows systems. Or as we'll see later on, you can use configuration management tools such as Ansible, Chef, or Puppet to describe out your infrastructure. And a Docker file is really that for a container. It's a set of instructions that make up what that image is, and then containers are run off of that image. So from the very beginning, the entry point of any Docker file is going to be the from command, and that's going to be the base template. So if you're using an analogy from VM, it's more of like your golden image, the template in VMware or your whatever hypervisor that you use to start off your virtual machines. That's essentially what this is. I've chosen to use CentOS, and that's the publisher. But then the actual version, or in Docker terminology, tag, is the CentOS 771908. So that's the base image. So when I start that up, I should expect a very much the same experience if I were to install CentOS as an operating system on a VM. Next is a series of run commands. So these run commands are really the sequential things that will build up to make the image. At the very beginning, I'm going to do a yum update, and then I'm going to install some developer tools. These are all required for me to install Ansible. I'm going to install the SSH client so I can communicate with Linux targets in Azure. And then I will install I'll upgrade pip, and then I'll use pip to install Ansible. And so that's the series of commands, using a backslash to separate them all out, but running them as part of one command. You want as few run commands as possible when you're building an image, because each one of these lines is a layer that build up the image, and the fewer you have, the lighter the image. So with the Docker file, I'll save the typing since I already have it here. Make sure I'm in the right directory. So now that we have a Docker file, we need to build the system or build the image onto our local Docker instance. So the command for that is docker build, and I'm just going to use a dot, and that means the relative directory. So it's going to look for that special file name of Docker file. And it'll run through all the steps, kind of like a bootstrap script, and it will build the image for me. While it's building, what's the knowledge level on Docker or containers in the audience? Have you used it before? Pretty familiar? Not at all?
I would suggest to raise your hands if you are familiar.
Yeah, or just drop a comment, whichever works.
Mm-hmm.
All right, looks like we got a little bit of experience. That was something, so containers, while this is building, I'll kind of riff on this. Containers is something that I somewhat avoided for a little while. I didn't know where, as I have an operations background, and with that, I didn't know where I fit into it. Like, it was very marketed as a dev-heavy technology where you needed to run an application. But this concept that I'm using here with a container in Ansible to create what's commonly known as an ops box or an operations box is a fantastic way to dabble in Docker and container technologies, because in the end, really what we do as sysadmins or as DevOps engineers is we build systems, and we can do that same thing in a different way, but with containers. So if you're struggling with where to start with containers, an ops box might be a really good start for you. Just throw some PowerShell in there. There's a lot of people. There's some cool Docker containers that Microsoft has put out that just have PowerShell in them to run, maybe Pester test or some unit tests, or even just some random automation with PowerShell. So there's a place for you to learn that as well. So the image is done building, and we can see a list of images by doing Docker images. And I have quite a few. So I'm just going to scroll to the top. When I ran the command docker build dot, I didn't specify any name. And when you do that, this might be a little bit hard to read. Let me expand this out a little bit. Run it again. It won't give a repository or a tag, but we can tell that it was that container because it was created about a minute ago, and my last run was about 6 days ago. So pretty confident that this is the image, but I don't really have any way of determining what this image is. I'd have to remember this image ID to start a container, and that isn't it's not very practical. And so what you can do with Docker is you can tag your images as seen here. So use the docker build command and then the -t option, and then you will give it the name of, the tag, but it'll become the name of the container, but then also this other part of the tag. So there's the name, but then there's also kind of the tag at the end that indicates the version, and latest is a special tag that will allow you to run a container without having to specify the tag. So if we run that, we'll notice that it ran super quick because it's pulling from that image that doesn't have a name, and it's using all of its layers to build the new image. So now if we clear the screen, Docker images, let me grep for Ansible. I'll expand that out again. A little bit more. There we go. I have a couple tags because I've been working off this for other products or projects. But now we can see that there is a new image called Ansible with the tag of latest, and it has a new container ID. And so that's what we'll use moving forward when we start to deploy Ansible through, or deploy Azure resources through Ansible. Now to run the container, you just use docker run Ansible. Helps if I type the command right. And notice that it didn't bring me to a prompt like I would expect. It doesn't emulate what I would expect to SSH into a target. And that's because by default, containers run detached in the background. So if we do a docker ps, we don't even see one. So that's going to print all the running containers. But if we do we'll see that we do have one that started and stopped 21 seconds ago. And that's because containers need something to have, they need something running in order to keep them running. Otherwise, Docker or whatever orchestrator on top, Kubernetes, is going to stop them. So if it's a website, it needs to have some kind of app that's serving up traffic. But in this case, it's just a container that has Ansible installed. And so there's nothing running in the background to keep it up and alive. And how we can get away with that using it as an ops box is we can use it as an integrated terminal. So when you add the -it, as you see here, it'll emulate SSHing into that container. So if we do docker run -it Ansible, I now have a different prompt. And if I do an ls, I can see that I'm in a different space. I'm not on my MacBook anymore. I'm now inside the container where I can run commands. And if I wanted to make sure that Ansible installed properly, I can type Ansible version. And I'm on 2.9.9, which is pretty cool. So I know Ansible is installed. One problem with the way that I'm running this container now is if I exit this and I do that docker ps-a again, I have two containers that are stopped on my system that are just taking up space. And that's fine if you want to every so often come in here and remove them, but there is a way that you can remove containers on exit. So if we clear the screen there, go back up to our run command and add the option of --rm. So that means it'll remove on exit. So here we are. We'll just verify Ansible again. Got the same version. It's good at working. And if I exit and I do that Docker PS, I should still only see 2. So that's a better way of working with it. As you exit, the container just goes away. Now, there's a little bit of caution here. So if you ever make any changes in your container, you upgrade the version of Ansible, you add in some plugins, you create a file that isn't mapped back to your host operating system, it's going to be deleted when it's gone. So you just need to be aware of that ephemeral state of the container. Now, the mounted volumes is the most useful aspect of using container for local development. What a mount allows you to do is to take a local folder or directory on your development laptop. So in my case, it's my MacBook, and then I can share it with the container. What that allows me to do is to edit files in VS Code and get all the glory of my IDE, or my IDE, where I have syntax highlighting, I have all my extensions, and all that fun stuff in an integrated terminal, which works great. But I also get the ability to run it from the container and don't have to rely on my laptop having Ansible installed. And to do that, you use the volume option. And then this $pwd works differently on Windows, so just a caveat there. But that'll take the working directory of where I am. In this case, it's become Ansible/chapter 01. And then it's going to share it as a folder or directory in the container as Ansible. So if I take this command and I run it, we'll add I don't need the latest tag. So now if I do an ls, I can see that I have an Ansible directory. And if I ls the Ansible, I should see the Docker file. And if I want to cat the Docker file, I can see that it looks like the above. Yep. And if I wanted to, I can just modify this. Just do another run command. Make sure it's all capital, so the syntax highlighter is happy. And if I cat again, the new line didn't show up very well, but there you can see my edited code. And that's extremely helpful and powerful when you're doing local development. Before using a container, we would have a jump box that we would have to SSH into, and then we'd use Git repositories to commit from our local up to that and then pull it down. And then I had to use Vi as my editor, which was fun for a while, and then it became very painful. It caused a lot of headaches. So this is just a lot better of a local development experience to use a mounted volume. One pain point with that was I had to change into the Ansible directory. Now, that might seem silly. It's just a cd command, but when you do it enough times, it becomes an annoyance. And there's a simple way with Docker to alleviate that, which is to specify your working directory. And that is the -- work directory option. And then you just tell it where you want to start the container, or where you want your integrated terminal to begin the prompt. And so we'll just say we want it to start at our volume mount point, which is the Ansible folder. We'll exit that container. And now I'm right at the Docker file. So I'm ready to go. I'm inside my Ansible directory where I potentially have my playbooks and all that good stuff. And I'm ready to go. And when I exit, it's not going to create a new one with some dead space. So that's good. Hey, there's the Proton Mail. So the next thing and the final thing, really, when you're working with this container, is you can set environment variables. This is really useful with Ansible because Ansible uses environment variables to drive its configuration of the server and of the different options that it has. And a good example of that is basically the secrets and the connection strings, so to speak, that you need to connect to a cloud provider such as AWS or, in our case, Azure. And what we'll see a little bit later is I'll use these to pass in my subscription ID and my service principal that I'm using to connect Ansible to Azure. That's authenticating me and giving me permissions to create resources in Azure. And I can do that when I launch the container with environment variables. So that way, when I get into the container, I don't need to set a bunch of files or create a bunch of strings and stuff like that and place them as files inside the system. Another option that you could do that I'll give you a reference for later is you can use a file. You can just, put a file in here with the password and then have it copied somewhere. That's totally an option. I choose to use environment variables. That way there's less likelihood of me committing my password source control. Not that I have done that, which I have. But the final thing that I'll mention is this container only lives on my laptop right now. And if my laptop were to crash, I would lose that container and all the work. Now, it's easily reproduced if I have the Docker file, but if the hard drive went bad, I'd probably lose that Docker file as well. And so an option that you have is you can push these images. And this is also how you share your container with your team or how you would use it as part of a CI/CD process and release pipeline. And a public free version would be Docker Hub, but you can use Azure Container Registry as well to store all of your containers. So that's just an option. I won't walk through that. So I'll take a brief moment and see if there's any questions before I move on.
Josh, I think we are good.
Yeah.
Someone is supposed to have a question.
Yep. Is the Docker file published with the image? No. So when you publish it, it's just the image that people can pull down. The Docker file isn't. So what you can do is you can attach your project in Docker Hub or wherever else to that. So ideally, your Docker file is committed somewhere in source control. So whether that be a project in Azure DevOps or GitHub or the like, and you're using, maybe the pipeline system with inside there, Azure pipelines, or potentially you'd be using GitHub Actions. This document you've written, is it publicly available? Yes, so all the examples here in the GitHub repository are public and you can download them. Yep, absolutely. The book on the left-hand side that you're seeing, chapter 1 is available for free, and then the rest of the 2 chapters are actually in draft that I'm working on right now. So kind of a sneak peek, so to speak.
Hey Josh, if you after the presentation or if you get a chance to post the link for your first chapter so that if someone wants to download.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, I think that should be helpful.
Yeah, there'll be some links towards the end too that'll a blog post that I've written that walk through all this as well. This is just in a little bit different format.
Okay.
Very cool. So, all right, if that's all the questions, we'll move on. The next part is we're going to connect to the cloud. So in our case, the cloud is going to be Azure. And so let's see here, to follow the instructions, let's connect to Azure. So the steps for Azure are going to be a little bit different. There's many ways that you can do this. You can authenticate with your Azure Active Directory. In this particular example, I'm going to be using a service principal that I'm going to be creating, and then I'm going to use the credentials of the service principal to connect Ansible to Azure. And I'm going to do it all through the container, so it's going to take a little bit of PowerShell, which is my favorite language. So we'll dive in there. So we've already got the container. Well, we'll start it. We've got the container up and running with this version of the file. And the very first thing that we're going to need to do is to register the PowerShell repository, the Red Hat one, because I'm using CentOS. All right, and then I'm going to install PowerShell with the yum command. Now I'm doing this all with inside the container, so when I exit, it's going to revert back to the file that you see above. When I'm done here and I've tested this all out and I'm happy with my results, I would need to update my Docker file and rerun the build command to get a new version of that Docker file. So now I have PowerShell installed. We'll switch to PowerShell from bash, $ps version table, running version 701. And then I'm going to use the AZ module. So instead of going into the Azure portal and creating the service principal, I'm going to use PowerShell. And to do that, I need to use the AZ module. And since I'm pulling from the PowerShell gallery, I'll have to confirm because it's untrusted at the moment. So as that installs, I'll talk about some of the options. So we're running Ansible with inside of a Docker container. A lower entry to barrier that would also take care of the authentication that I'm about to set up would be the Cloud Shell. And if we have enough time, I'll dive into that as well. Ansible is available inside the Cloud Shell. So now that I have PowerShell installed, I'm going to connect to Azure with the Connect AZ account commandlet. It's going to give me a code and a URL. Let's put that in. All right, I've been signed in. So now I could do get AZ resource. Ooh. And I can see that I'm authenticated and I'm pulling in all the resource groups from my subscription. So that's good. Chapter 2. All right, we'll leave that be. So the next thing that I need to do is to create a service principal. And there's a little bit of PowerShell here to do that. We'll look it over here because it's a little bit easier to read. So I'm going to create a credential object and use the new object Microsoft Azure command Active Directory PSA password to store a password as part of that credential. And then also a username. Where's my username at? Okay. So we'll populate this. I think that would be long enough. I'm not sure. All right. Change back to my container. Okay, so we have a credential object with a password. And then I'm going to create a hash table. And I'm going to change this name because I already have one named Ansible to Omaha. Just make sure that my hash table is correct. And then I'll take that command and I'll splat it to the new AZ AD service principal to create the service principal. And then I'm going to store that in a variable because I'm going to need the information from that service principal later on in the script or in the process. Okay, we have a new service principal and all the information stored in a variable. And now we could use all this information that you see here, plus the tenant ID and stuff like that to connect, but the service principal hasn't been assigned any roles yet. So we need to assign the roles to give the service principal permission so when we authenticate, we can actually do something. And so we'll take this subscription ID, so get AZ context. Grab the name. This is so I can get the subscription ID. So I'll skip that step. Instead of giving my pay as a go, I'll just grab it from the context. But I will assign it to the sub ID. And then I'll create another hash table called role assignment splat. I will take the object ID of the service principal, pulling that out of the previously defined object. I'm going to give it the contributor to the entire subscription, just because it's easy and it's a test subscription that I have. And I'll delete the service principal later. And then I'll define the scope. So it's going to be from the subscription, but then it'll be the sub ID that I'm assigning, giving it the role of contributor. Create that hash table. Just make sure the hash table created correctly. Looks good. Go ahead and assign the new role. All right. So I can either exit the container and use the environment variables, or I can just use the export command and start to populate them. So I can use PowerShell to grab all this information. Subscription name. I'll just clear this real quick. Switch back to PowerShell real quick. Grab the name. Name's a little bit easier to grab the sub ID. So just redefine this new variable. Oh. Here, we'll just do this. Okay, so I'm setting an environment variable called Azure Subscription ID. That is an environment variable that Ansible will look for that particular information, and it'll use it to configure its authentication. So we can use PowerShell to get the client ID. We'll change Ansible again to Ansible Omaha because we're using a different service principal. There we go. So that should work to define the client ID. Now we need the secret. And the secret was just that. Then we need the tenant ID. So echo. We'll change this to ID instead of name. And then we'll use the subscription ID as part of that call to get the tenant. Just make sure that pulled in properly. Yep, so I got my tenant ID. And now I can define that variable. Okay. So now I can attempt to create a resource group with Ansible. Now I'm going to use an Ansible ad hoc command. So it's very similar to a commandlet or a bash command that you would use. That language can be expanded into a playbook. So the command here is Ansible. That's the command line utility for ad hoc commands. It requires that you target something, so it needs a host pattern. When you use the host pattern of localhost, it'll target the local machine, which in this case is the container that's running Ansible. And then I'm providing a module. So modules are how Ansible executes tasks. Everything inside Ansible does relate to a module, especially when you're going to a playbook. So there's modules that ping, that test connectivity. There's ones that create files. In this case, it is creating an Azure RM resource group. And then the arguments that it needs are a name and a location. So the name is Ansible and the location is US East. And I don't have the required Python modules, which is to be expected because I haven't added them yet. So inside, just like with PowerShell, if you're familiar with that, you need PowerShell modules to extend your abilities. And so for this instance, Azure isn't built into the core Ansible content, so you need to install it with pip. So pip is a Python package manager. So we'll use pip to install the Ansible Azure modules. And this again will be a command that I'll want to add to my Docker file. So when I rerun the container, I'll be able to have that there. Oh, looks like I missed a question from Lance. Export is a command of what for bash? So export is like setting an environment variable. So was it like set variable, the .NET method, or were you just doing $env var name equals whatever in PowerShell? So it's just a way of populating environment variables essentially. All right, so now we have the Azure packages installed. Let's go ahead and try and create that resource group again. And we got a success. So it changed because it didn't exist yet. This is the real power of using a configuration management tool such as Ansible, because by default, their modules are built to be idempotent, which means that you can run them over and over again. A common example that I use with PowerShell or Bash is when you create a folder or a directory, it works the first time, but then say you want to do another pass, you have to add additional logic to see if it exists and then handle that error that it does exist, where Ansible is written to handle the scenarios because the modules are idempotent. So instead of running into an error the second time I run it, it returns back a success. So that's just a difference between an imperative language and a declarative language that we can see in action. We can validate that the resource group exists with PowerShell if we want. Maybe we don't trust Ansible yet. So we can see that PowerShell is returning stuff. We can even go to the portal and see if it's there. And so that's it for connecting. So to recap, we've built a Docker file that has an Ansible environment within it. We've started it. We've made some changes. We've provisioned a service principal to connect to Azure with, and then we've created a resource group. So now comes the time to use Ansible to create its own development environment. So since Ansible is a configuration management tool, there are a lot of modules that allow you to provision infrastructure. So you could use, this is where it gets really confusing, right? You have Terraform, you have CloudFormation if you're in AWS, and you have Azure ARM templates or Azure Resource Manager templates if you're purely in the Azure world. Where Ansible is a nice fit, though, is that it works for both on-prem, if you have VMware or Hyper-V, and it works in the cloud. Now, I will say Terraform is a better fit if all you're doing is provisioning infrastructure. But as soon as you have it like more of an IS stack where you're using virtual machines a lot, there is a component of Ansible with the configuration management, that continual change management of mutable infrastructure, where it becomes very powerful. And it's also very powerful with orchestrated automation and reducing toil through automating repeated tasks and delegating them. And so what we'll do here is we'll use Ansible to deploy its own development environment that you can use to configure. So we'll use Ansible to deploy the machines out into Azure and to configure them. So if we go back and looking at the book, we need to switch to chapter 3. So I'll just browse to chapter 3. And we'll open up the Azure section, close out of our PowerShell script, and then we'll jump down to the Azure section here. So if you're not familiar, in Azure, there's several components or microservices more or less that make up a virtual machine. It's not just a template anymore that you have in VMware that spins up, and there's a single artifact that makes up of a virtual machine. The virtual machine is made up of several resources. First, you're going to need a resource group. You're going to need somewhere to put it. You will need a virtual network to provide networking, whether that's public or inside of Azure in a data center. You'll need a subnet, a public IP in our case, because we're using the container running locally on my laptop to hit the public interface or the public IP of these virtual machines. A network security group to allow traffic in and out. You're going to need a network interface card on that virtual machine to communicate out of the Azure data centers and whatnot. And we'll need a custom script extension to provision it. So when you use Ansible, Ansible is an agentless configuration management tool. That's one thing that sets it apart, or at least differentiates it from Puppet and Chef, where they require agents to be installed on the machines, and you have to bake them in or find some way of deploying them. Ansible doesn't do that. It relies solely on a remote procedure protocol. So for Linux, it relies on SSH, and for Windows, it relies on WinRM. It presents somewhat of a chicken and the egg scenario that we'll see about a little bit later, but it works great if you don't want to have another agent running somewhere in your environment, and you want to rely on a remote procedure protocol. And then lastly, you need the actual virtual machine resource itself. So if you look here on this table, those are all the things that I listed out. And on the right are the Ansible modules that equate to that resource. And you'll see how they're used here in a second. So we've already done this step. We've gone in here. Let's exit the container though, because right now we only have this Docker file open. Let's see here, print env grep. I don't want to have to go through the pain of grabbing all my environment variables again, so I'm just going to steal these, put them there. We'll exit. So we'll change back to the directory of chapter 3. We'll change in the Azure directory, and from here's where we'll start the container backup. Now, if you remember, I did have to install the package manager for Python. So instead of going through and repeating all that, what we'll do is we'll cat this Docker file, and we'll see that it has all the commands that I had before. So it's even got the Azure one. What we'll do instead of running a new container instance and doing that is we'll just rebuild the image from this new Docker file. So if we do Docker, let's look at our history here. History of Docker build. We'll see the latest. So what I'll do is I'll just override the latest tag again with my new container image. And you can see that it added a few new things. If I had run this against the old one, it would have said, you're fine, all the layers match. But it noticed a few different commands. So it noticed that there was a different PowerShell one. It noticed that there was this run pip install. And so it ran those, hopefully. And now we'll start the container up and see if we have PowerShell. So we've got PowerShell. I think we're on the new image. So pip list, grep Azure. It's listing all the ones out there. So yep, so it installed all of our Azure stuff as well. So now that that's the case, the only thing that we do need to do is to set all the environment variables back up. So we could list them all out as such, or we can use the environment variables to run. So easy enough. You can see how disposable your environment becomes. If it's a container, I can just exit, I can start back over. So I have all these up here. What I'm going to do is just replace these placeholder things with the data that I need. So here's the tenant. Replace that here. And then on the client ID. Oop. There we go. And password. and then the subscription, which is over here. Okay. So now I can just run this instead of having to run all my export commands again. So for it's an invalid format. So we can just remove all the line breaks. I have a feeling that's what's tripping it up. We'll run it as a single command. There we go. So now if we do print env grep Azure, we should see all of our stuff. And we can also run, we could run the resource group if we wanted to create, but we'll turn it into a playbook and we'll run that in just a second. So we'll close that. So now we're up and running. We're in the new files. We have access to all these playbooks that are on my local machine in a different directory. They're now mapped inside the volume of the container, and we're ready to get off to the races with this. So the first thing that we want to do with those resources is we wanted to create a resource group. Now we created that with an ad hoc command, but ad hoc commands they're really great for infrequent tasks or one-off things. More or less what you would use a commandlet for. You want to get a piece of data, but a more repeatable thing to do would be to create it as a playbook. So a playbook in Ansible is what is used to, it's basically how to codify the automation. And if we open up Azure Resource Group, this is what it looks like. When you go and you start to research Ansible on your own, you'll see all of the documentation refer to playbooks and not ad hoc commands, because the basis of Ansible as a configuration management tool is the playbook itself. And kludging them together or joining them together in a way that defines the end state of your infrastructure is really the power of what Ansible is. And so they skip past it. But all these modules can be called from the Ansible command themselves. And so if you were to take that command that we ran, we know that we needed a host pattern, which is localhost. We just have to add this host line here to declare that. One way to make sure that it's connecting locally with a playbook versus trying to SSH out and back in is to use this connection local. So that is telling the playbook you're going to execute locally against the server that requests the execution. From there, there's a sequence of tasks, and this should look very familiar. In this case, I'm giving it a name instead of just running the task. I'm saying this is the task to create the resource group, but it's using the same module. It's using the Azure RM resource group, and it takes two parameters, the name and location. Those are the same arguments that we provided to the commandlet. They're just now in an easier to read, repeatable form called a playbook. And so how we run those is with the Ansible playbook command, and then we specify the name of the playbook. So create resource group YAML. And we get the same result. So it returned back OK because the resource group had already existed. And that's where it returned back the status OK, where the first time we executed it, it didn't exist yet, so it went to changed. Now, if I were to change the location here or maybe the name and create a different resource group, it would report back a changed state because it created a different one in a different location or region. But the key thing to remember is just the structure, where you have your host line, some variables potentially, and then ultimately the tasks that you're going to execute. Now, Ansible does execute these sequentially, as we'll see when we create the VM. So the order matters. You can't have, the VM create before the NIC and so forth. And you use the order of the playbook to determine those dependencies. All right, so let's just take a quick look at the Windows VM playbook. Oops. Minimize the prompt. So in the very beginning, we have that localhost again because it's running locally and it's going to provision it elsewhere. It's going to connect to Azure and it's going to deploy a virtual machine in this case. Now I have a prompt here. You could store this as a variable with clear text, or in Ansible, there's something called Ansible Vault that you can encrypt your strings and passwords to secure them. In this case, I am just going to create a variable that prompts you for the password. Echo no means that it's not going to show the output. It's going to be blank as you enter it. And then it's going to register that and then use that password later on. So the first task that we have here is the create virtual network. So we're going to use the Azure RM virtual network. It has a few parameters. It needs a resource group, a name, and then an address prefix. We then need a subnet for the Windows machine. Again, it's just a matter of using that module that interacts with that resource, just like what you would do with an ARM template, where you have these different resources that you can use to build upon each other to create the resources. Difference is this isn't JSON, it's YAML. Love it or hate it kind of thing. I've grown to really like it. I have no problem with JSON at all either. It's just more verbose in my opinion. It's kind of a trade-off. You got the verbosity of JSON, or you have white space hell with YAML. So, pick your poison. But then we're going to create the public IP address. I've chosen to use a debug command to output that so I can see it as it runs and I don't have to go to the portal or run PowerShell to be able to get the IP address back. We'll create the security group. And for the Windows, I'm going to need RDP potentially. So I'm creating a rule for that. And then it'll become an IIS web server. So I'll open up ports 80 and 443. And then a key element here, because Ansible is agentless, it needs to communicate over PowerShell remoting, and that uses 5985 and 5986. And it needs to have both of them. Well, not both of them. You can configure it to use one or the other. I've chosen to open both. Create the network card, or network interface rather, and then tie it all. See how these were all dependent on the previous resources that will be created prior. And Ansible's using the sequence to determine that dependency chain. There's no depends on in Ansible. There's conditions, but sequence is usually how you weed those dependencies out. Then it's going to create the virtual machine down here. Now, the custom script extension requires a little bit of conversation, I suppose. So there's a couple ways that you could do this. It really comes down to two pieces of information. How are you going to authenticate and what protocol are you going to use? In this example, I'm going to use PowerShell remoting over HTTPS, which is 5986, I think, right? Yeah, 5986. And by default, that's not open on the firewall, and there aren't any certificates. So I'm going to use a custom script extension to solve the problem of the chicken and the egg. Because when I provision this resource in Azure, the problem is going to be the resource exists, I can't talk to it. But I can leverage existing automation that's in Azure to provision the machine to the point that Ansible can connect to it. And then from there, take the configuration of installing IIS and all that good stuff. But what this allows me to do is to use Azure's functionality within inside Ansible. So I don't have two systems managing it. I have the entire process codified in Ansible, but I'm leveraging technology that is provided by Azure in this case. And what this is doing is it's going to download a file from the Ansible GitHub repository to configure Ansible for remoting. And what that does is it generates some self-signed certificates, opens up the ports for HTTPS, which allows the Ansible to communicate with that host. And then I'm just going to run it unrestricted on the host as part of that custom script extension. And then this is another neat part that Ansible provides is I can wait for that to be completed. And how I'm going to test that is I'm going to use the get facts to get the public IP address. And then I'm going to wait for this port to become available in the timeout of 600 seconds. And the host will be the public IP that I grabbed from the WinWeb IP address, which is the Windows VM that we're creating here. So when the playbook is done, I can have full confidence that the machine is ready for me to configure with the next step. So without further ado, let's go ahead and provision a Windows machine because that takes a while. -I, playbook Azure, create Windows virtual machine. I should be prompted for a password. All right. All right, so I've got a password. Go ahead and create. And for the sake of time, let's add another. I closed my prompt. I guess we'll wait. Oh, so there we go. We got my public IP address there. So as we wait, any questions? Oh, it looks like we got one from a couple minutes ago. So am I using any special VS Code extensions for the YAML? Let me look. And this one I'm not. So I can show you while that's being created. I typically use Insider. And this will probably be super small, so I'll adjust. But here's an example of the Linux one. But I use this one called Indent Rainbow to give me some super cool spacing. Basically colors the bars of where the indent the spaces are. And it also highlights white spaces. So if I leave a space, it'll highlight that as well with inside here. But I can definitely link at the end some of the extensions that I enjoy using. There's an Ansible one, or if you hover over, it'll give you a link to the documentation. So if we open this up, it'll take me to this module. And I can browse. It's called the Ansible module index. And so this is where you can see all the parameters. And then down below are some very useful examples of how to use that. So some real world examples of how to create and delete right here. Most of them have, probably 5, 6, sometimes 10 examples, which is really awesome. And then it also tells you what you should expect to be returned. So you can store those in variables and use them elsewhere. So that's a good extension. But yeah, I think the Indent Rainbow is the only one I use. I just got a new laptop, so I'm still setting up some of it. But yeah. Was it Hodge? There's a really nice article by a friend of mine named Matt Hodge who has it's used for Terraform, and I think it's used for why is it escaping me? CloudFormation, but CloudFormation's in YAML as well, and he has a really awesome blog post about how to set up your VS Code extensions that make YAML a lot easier. My favorite is the one that puts a dot where the white space is, because if I didn't have that, I'd be chasing white spaces for a vast majority of my day. All right, we're still creating the Windows VM. Any other questions? Matt Hodge. I can send a link to his Twitter bio and blog at the end. Okay, so we're setting up the HTTPS listener. We'll go ahead and look at the Linux playbook. I don't know if I'll have run time to let it execute, but here we go. So this is very much the same set of things. It's going to prompt for a password. We're going to create this, add the subnet. And one thing you'll notice as I scroll down here, it's basically just modifying it, changing the names, swapping out Windows for Linux. I'm using a different image. Obviously, I'm going to use CentOS version 8.0. And then I'm also running a custom extension where I update the sudoers. So when you're creating a Linux VM, one thing to be aware of, the user that you're using to connect to Ansible with needs to have no password in the sudoers file. So it needs to have obviously administrator rights, but it also needs to be not prompted for sudo. Otherwise, when you try to elevate and you try to run anything that requires elevation, it'll error out and say that you're not running as root, or it'll time out on a prompt. So that's one thing to just note. So this is a pretty static playbook right now as we wait for that VM to create. What we can do here is we can add variables to make this repeatable. So now I have a way of creating a Windows machine, a VM in Azure, but it only works for this particular VM with a certain name. And so what you can do, like any automation, is you can add some dynamicness to it by variables. So I could add prompts for a host name, which would allow me to potentially delegate this out to people if they wanted to, but it would create the VM in the way that I want it to be created. But for my case, in my lab, what I do is I just spin this up, I develop some Ansible, and then I delete it. So, all right, let's see if still working on the extension. And you'll notice that you're not getting a lot of detail here. When it says change, it's just telling you, like, did it run okay, did it not? You can turn verbosity on with every run of your playbook with -v, and the number of V's that you have determines the level of verbosity that you get, and it would give you all of the Python or PowerShell calls. That's another really awesome advantage that I've seen with Ansible is it leverages. I haven't run across any Ruby modules, but a vast majority are written in Python, but there are a large number of modules that are written in PowerShell. So if you have a PowerShell background, Ansible was Ansible was a really easy way or an easy tool to get into because most of the stuff that I used was written in PowerShell, especially to modify and configure Windows hosts. All right, looks like that VM's been created. So I'm going to kick off the Linux one real quick. And then we'll go in the Azure portal and we'll check out if it created the VM. Okay, so that's off to the races. All right, looks like we have a new resource group. And that resource group has a Windows VM in it with all the stuff, which is super cool. So it's running. Let's see if I can ping it in a different prompt. Well, ICMP isn't open, so we'll run a ping command in a second. But I could try to RDP. Though I don't think I have that installed. All right, there we go. All right, so in the template, there was a user named Ansible. So let's see if we can connect. And voila.
Cool.
So I ran out of time because of my fumbling with the getting connected to the Teams meeting and having to give it permissions. But there are additional playbooks that I have set up in here that'll configure it as a Windows IIS website that you could hit, do a curl command or invoke web request and see the default landing page for IIS. But yeah, just another way to create a VM essentially. But it's really kind of the starting point. It's what got me into using Azure, but now I'm using it for a whole lot more, and we'll be using a ton more in my new job that I'll be starting soon. But it's been really fun. It was a way to use a technology that I was intimately familiar with to learn another one. And it can go the other way. So if you already have a good grasp of Azure and you know what a virtual machine is and all the different resources, it's not hard to translate that into a YAML format for Ansible. But looks like we got 6 minutes. I'll let this go up, and I can continue talking forever, but I'll kind of end it there. And I guess to wrap it up, we'll go back to the slides.
Hey
And
Josh. Hey
yeah,
Josh. There is a question. Casey has asked the question. Did you answer that?
yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Sorry, I minimized that.
Oh, okay.
Where'd it go? Teams. There it is. Sorry. So is there any reason why the code says Azure RM instead of just Azure AZ for the? That's just it existed prior and they haven't updated the naming convention. Would be my best guess. Microsoft is working on their own Ansible module for Azure, so I would expect that to be relevant with the new naming conventions and so forth. That's in preview right now and not documented on Ansible's website currently. Oh, looks like we got a Linux machine. So go back to the portal. We've now got the Linux web. And this one, I believe I opened SSH2, so we can Ansible public IP. Assuming I put the password in right. And voila! We have a Linux machine. And so I can delete this resource group and run 2 playbooks or 1 playbook if I tie them together and reproduce my local development environment with a container or with VMs running in Azure. So I'll go ahead and do that. Just going to delete my resource group. Actually, if we want to get fancy, could do it with this. So state absent. So setting that will start the deletion of the resource group. It takes like 10 minutes to do, so we won't sit there and watch that. So let's go back to the slides. So if you want to try it now, I ran out of time here, but the Cloud Shell will automatically authenticate you with the user that you logged into. And I'll make the link for the slides so you can follow along available in the chat, or I'll have them sent out as well. But basically open Cloud Shell, use code with inside Cloud Shell to create a playbook. Grab this playbook, it's on GitHub. I'll send the link, put that in, and then use Ansible playbook.yaml, and you'll have a new resource group. And then you can say that you've officially used Ansible. If you want to learn more, you can. There's a few blog posts that I've written. One is using Ansible like PowerShell. I really struggled in the beginning with Ansible because I came from a scripting background and automation with PowerShell, and it just worked differently. And so this blog post basically shows you how you can use Ansible like PowerShell in more of an imperative way where you run it against specific hosts for scripting and coding, just to kind of get your feet underneath or your foundation with Ansible. The next one walks through a more detailed example of what I briefly went through with containers, and that's available on the dev blogs. And then I have a 5-part series which I walk through here. I only got through about part 2 where I created the VMs. Part 3, 4, and 5 show you how to provision them with IS Connect with the remoting protocols that I showed you, and then use Azure Key Vault to pull credentials and passwords from Key Vault versus having them stored in Ansible. And then if you're interested, I don't know why I didn't go to that slide. I am writing a book. So all this, I'm taking the blog posts that I've written, putting that all into a book that's available. The first chapter is free on becomeansible.com. You can get the first part, which is the first 3 chapters. On Gumroad right now, I have chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 in rough draft. And hopefully we'll have it done in the next couple months. And then if you want to follow me, the best place is on Twitter at Josh Duffney. From there, you can find my blog and all the other social medias that I use. Twitter's the one that I'm the most active on, though. So that's the easiest one. But with that, thank you so much for bearing with me as I fumbled through that, trying to get connected. And thank you so much for your time.